This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everybody. My name is David Myers. I'm the Executive Director of the Conservation Finance Alliance. And it is with great pleasure that we're going to have a webinar today from the Blue Natural Capital Finance Facility from IUCN. And just before we get into that, just want to remind everyone that we have an ongoing webinar series with a whole range of topics, and I guess in about a week or so we'll have a talk around public-private partnerships and the COVID situation, which should be quite interesting. And so stay tuned for that. And you can register for any of the webinars on our website, conservationfinancealliance.org. And really excited today to present our colleague IUCN. To take you in the Blue Natural Capital Finance Facility, and I'm passing you through the webinar. Nina, over to you.
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you, David, and thank you to the Conservation Finance Alliance for hosting this webinar. I'm very excited to be moderating this session today. So actually, IUCN have been working on blue infrastructure finance as part of our Blue Natural Capital Funding Facility. It's a funding facility that primarily supporting promising projects, project developer and businesses, combining the return on investment, but also working and activities with nature-based solutions in coastal regions. As part of that, we are running a knowledge series where you can actually go to the website. You can find information on blue bonds or positive impact framework. But today we will be focused on a recently launched report, Blue Infrastructure Finance, which is a new approach to integrating nature-based solutions for coastal resilience. So I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the government of Sweden for their generous support in supporting this knowledge series, and also to the government of Luxembourg, which is supporting the Blue Natural Capital Funding Facility. For this report that we launched, there we have a very broad range of collaborators. So we were very thankful for the wide range of expertise. The set of experts, and they're very diverse backgrounds, and they have long-standing expertise in everything from conservation, finance, engineering, disaster risk reduction, and coastal resilience. So when we kick off today, I like to also say that, we use the word blue, but obviously because of the focus of, marine and coastal, but nature-based solutions obviously are across the board, but we're focusing on the coastal and marine environment here today. And the goal of the webinar is really to show how we can integrate nature-based solutions in the context of coastal infrastructure development. And if it's well done, the projects can become more resilient and as well as financially attractive to investors. So we'll have a lineup of 3 speakers today that we'll start off with a presentation. The presentation would be followed by a Q&A session. So we're really excited. We've seen that there's a lot of diversity and range of expertise of the participants today. So we really encourage your active participation and to move this discussion forward. So I will seek help from my colleague who will help me then bring out some questions which the panelists can address. So I'd like to start off to introduce the first speaker that we have with us today. It's my colleague from IUCN, Dorothy Herr. She's the manager for our oceans and climate change work, focusing a lot on policies and specializes in nature-based solutions. So when we talk about nature-based solutions, I mean, what do we really mean? What actually defines or constitutes a nature-based solution? So I'd like to really kind of start with a kind of basic, and also to look at what do we mean by blue natural capital, and how is that relevant, or how is that related to coastal infrastructure and coastal development? So I'd like to hand over the word to you, Dorothy. So please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great, Thank you very much, and I hope the connection is good and everyone can hear us. So first, I want to start with a sort of quote and a little story. Well, basically, when we were writing this report back in February, I sat on the train with Torsten after sort of our core group met and really tried to finalize this report, and it was about the Dutch working on their coastal development, linking it to NBS. And there was one sentence that stuck with me, and that said, quote, "Stupid infrastructure still has a business case, making us more vulnerable with every dollar we spend." So I find it quite fascinating, so I also took it into the publication. But I think really the point about this blue infrastructure paper and this approach, which you'll hear about today, is sort of making this business case for why we want to integrate and why it's useful to integrate nature-based solutions in infrastructure development, finding the right partners, and then above all, finding the right finance model of how this can be done. And please don't get me wrong, I know this is a big topic, and certainly we are not able to probably answer all the questions in this hour, but hopefully give a glimpse of what we see as opportunities lying ahead of us, and really having maybe a to-do list for us all on moving this topic forward. Next slide. Can we have the slide changed? Perfect, thank you. So in terms when we talk infrastructure, we obviously first, at least my mind always goes to the negative impacts that we have seen and will also in the future further see on coastal and marine ecosystems. But then we also see that there is so much need for further infrastructure in the coming years. Specifically in developing countries, there will be opportunities that need to be seized, as a lot of this vital infrastructure is lacking, and some reports predict about $94 trillion that need to be spent until 2040. However, we also see a report that really demonstrates the cost efficiency of having such integrated solution also linked to climate to ultimately reduce the long-term expenditure. And I think this is where sort of nature-based solutions come in, and really trying to find the means to sort of bring this massive investment need to the right partners and also the nature-based solutions. And I think what you saw, for those who were able to see, look into the report, that we talk a lot about the role from multilateral development banks in this case, but obviously and financiers as well. Next one, please. So here is just to basically provide the basics around what blue natural capital per se is, a well-known one, which includes the ecosystem services around what the ecosystems produce to us in terms of clean air, food, and so on, and also relates to climate change mitigation and adaptation. And the nature-based layer on top of that is actually the actions that we take to protect, sustainably manage, or restore this blue natural capital so that it does serve the societal needs in order to have also other co-benefits, etc. I see we have a little problem with the slide. Nevertheless, I'm going forward. Also mentioning in terms of with the work that ISN is doing on nature-based solutions is that we are about to launch new standards, an NBS standards, which is there to try and provide really a common understanding and way forward how we label or how we and sort of bring nature-based solutions to scale. So watch the space there in a month, or should be out. Next slide, please. And this is just an attempt, at least personally, I like visuals very much, to sort of give a sense of what is it that we're actually talking about when this is about nature-based solution. And this obviously in the graphic trying to depict that if we have coastal infrastructure development without NBS, it often ignores the benefits and services that we know from this blue natural capital, be it CO2 emission reductions or coastal protection, but that we're also missing the economic opportunity and means to reduce the risk, which we'll hear about later more. And then also we know from such settings that cost-benefit analysis hardly internalize some of these negative impacts that nevertheless coastal development has on nature. Next one, please. In comparison, sort of what are the win-wins that we can have here? Have a more integrated approach, bringing in this sort of more gray hard infrastructure, and so really when we talk about recycled plants or other type of roads, etc., there will be to ensure that we have high environmental and social safeguards, also following the mitigation hierarchy. But again, looking at this more integrated and see how from, for example, renewable energy, how can that be integrated around marine protected areas, having spillover effects for fisheries, the role of mangroves, not only for CO2 emission reduction, but above all also for coastal resilience, disaster risk reduction. So really taking some of these connections into account and also showing that over time, really if we do it well, this can reduce the risk of some of these infrastructure itself in terms of climate change impacts. And I think that's really also my last point, is that we need really look forward to the integrated planning approaches that take into account ecosystem services assessment, for example, bringing the right partners and experts. And as Mina had said in their introduction, really also with this paper, we try to bridge between conservation, finance, and engineering, and really bringing, another layer to this and moving ahead with this concept. And I think, at least from my day-to-day work, it has really been incredible how in the last years the concept idea of nature-based solutions has been taken on board. However, that there's still some struggle of really how to putting it in practice, and what we see as well is this sort of how do we want to do it from the finance community, which is very encouraging. So I think there we can really have and make opportunities happen. So thank you. Mina, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dorothy, for that excellent framing of what nature-based solutions are and the importance of investing in nature-based solution as well, and as well as looking at it as an opportunity to build back bluer, if you like. I think you were breaking up a little bit, but I think that we got most of it. It was a little bit of poor connection there. So again, if there's any clarifying questions as well, we will also be able to get back to that, but we will have an opportunity later on as well to speak about that. So I think you brought some very, very good points forward, and I think it's really clear that this is something that we need to look at. And even if it's kind of a new concept, and the concept is there, but I think now that we have this conceptual idea, it's also to look at how are these actually being implemented. So what could be a kind of concrete examples, because you lifted quite a few examples with a broad range from renewable energy, MPAs, etc. But I think also having a standard on nature-based solutions kind of gives that kind of guidance and so well as what it means. I think it would be really worthwhile and now look at this resilient concept for coastal infrastructure. And I would like to invite the next speaker, Steve Crooks, working for Silverstone. Steve, you've been working for many years in the field of coastal wetland and restoration projects. What can you show us in terms of examples from the field? Like what kind of concrete things, and how does climate change play into coastal infrastructure development and ultimately nature-based solutions? I'll give the floor over to you. Welcome, Steve.
Great. Thank you very much, Mina, and good afternoon or good morning, everybody. Can I get my slides, please? And while the slides are coming up, I'll just kind of mention, in our working group, as part of the report, we focused on how do you build resilience within coastal restoration and coastal development. And coastal development has been going on under human society since the Bronze Age in southern Mesopotamia, where it first started. And we gained hugely from development, building ports, food resources, transport, access to water, access to fish. But now in a very densely populated world, we've really pushed that to the limits. And we need now to develop a more sustainable approach to our coastal management. And I don't know, can anybody else see my slides, or is it only me that can't see them?
Not yet.
Yeah.
So.
No, Kumar, you need to set this. Was Kumar doing the slides? Yeah, so Kumar, you need to take presentation role again there, and I think someone by accident took over the slides.
We have a nice picture of somebody's beach.
It was really lovely. There you go.
There we go. Great.
Okay. Let's forward through. Next one, please. There we are. And so here are a number of facts. I'll not go through them all, but basically there's an awful lot of infrastructure that's vulnerable right now under existing levels of sea level. And with even a little bit of sea level rise over the next century, that amount is going to increase dramatically. There's already $100 trillion worth of infrastructure at risk from flooding. But it's not just the infrastructure. A lot of the infrastructure is related to provisioning of food or provisioning of water. A lot of wastewater treatment plants, for instance, are at sea level. But despite all these enormous challenges, we're really not terribly prepared for what's going to come with sea level rise. And we need to be working towards building a more resilient approach to addressing sea level rise as we move forward. And how do we build in increasing our green spaces, our blue spaces, rather than losing them as the tides rise against infrastructure. Next slide, please. And so really, the type of infrastructure that's built up over the last, few thousand years really has been focused on building rigid structures, but we're recognizing now that it's a dynamic coastline. And so we need to try and build in dynamicism into our coastal development. And so that really drives us to think about resilience. How do we build resilience concepts into our coastal development? What can we do to reduce our sensitivity to events and ongoing changes? How can we reduce our exposure to risk, both in terms of the natural environment and the human environment? And what can we do to build adaptive capacity into our development plans? Part of the answer to this is really that the activities that we undertake in the coastal systems can't be thought of independently, but really need to be thought of in the context of landscapes. Where do they fit into the landscape? How will the landscape change in the future? What are the drivers? How will the projects be phased in and out? How will things change? And we have to recognize the importance that we have to maintain as much as possible intact ecosystems. The intact ecosystems which are out there are becoming rarer and rarer and closer and more dissected. So protect what we have, restore what we can, and green up those gray areas and do less of the graying of green areas. Next slide, please. And I just want to give a couple of examples here. This is a project in San Francisco Bay, and it's actually the gray areas are developed areas. And what the local Contra Costa County Flood Control Agency is, they're opening up the floodplain for flood management benefits. They recognize that if you increase space, it reduces flood risk. And while doing this, you also get other ecosystem services benefits back as well. And so what's interesting is that more often these days, you are seeing agencies who have real skin in the game for risk reduction, engaging in habitat restoration projects, not primarily for the benefit of the habitat, but for the benefit of flood risk reduction with other ecosystem services stacked on top of that. Next slide, please. And projects are getting more and more expensive, more and more complicated, but we're tackling bigger issues. This is a project, for instance, which is the Hamilton Wetlands Restoration Project, where a former Army air base, which was built in the 1930s, has been decommissioned and now converted back to a wetland. Here, the sediment from the deepening of the Port of Auckland, 7 million cubic yards, were pumped into this site and then sculpted to create high intertidal wetlands, wildlife corridors, additional flood protection for the neighbours, and also soft areas for tidal wetlands. And the habitat at the site is evolving very nicely indeed. And so, if you're willing to go through these processes, you can start to roll back the line of the shoreline, restore habitat as part of the process. But I will make the point again that conserving intact wetlands is more cost effective and maintains better ecology over the long term. Next slide, please. What I should have mentioned in this slide, so we'll just stay on this one, but what I should have mentioned in the previous slide, to enable complicated projects and to enable good adaptation to climate change, you need a good planning process. Science needs to be in the middle of that, and understanding what the success criteria of the projects are, what the performance criteria are for engineers is really important. Projects should not just be winging it, it should be based on the landscape context and based upon good planning. And then you can share your experiences, reviewers can review it, and monitoring plans and adaptive management plans can be developed. Now, if we're going to scale up projects, again, conserve intact wetlands, restore degraded systems, and let's green the built environment. We should also invest in things like marine protected areas because they provide an institutional and regulatory framework in which you can then do a lot of good planning. Where does your development fit into this? Where does your conservation fit into this? Where does finance and climate policy fit into this? Demonstration is needed of how we build together these environmental and built projects. But importantly, particularly for coastal engineers who are ultimately responsible for safety and doing no harm within coastal areas, we need to develop and quantify performance metrics for our environmental part of projects so that we can compare one project against another equally, so that we recognize all the costs and benefits associated with a project. Right now, the environmental side is hidden, and that's why we lose a lot of environmental aspects of projects. And again, we need to plan for long-term adaptation. And my last slide, next one, please. And one last point to make is really we need to have a broad, inclusive process as part of this. Development in the past has often been for one sector or one particular party. But if we're going to manage our coastal ecosystems more holistically, we need a broad range of stakeholders at the table, from local inhabitants to different sectors. So we capture all of the opinions and we make the best decisions possible. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was excellent. You clearly highlighted the enormous challenges and the urgent reality of actually building more resilience in coastal infrastructure, and with following up with some really concrete examples. So what we can take from your presentation is really the kind of the process and the approach to do this is really through building adaptive capacity and really working in an integrated way at a landscape or seascape level, but also really emphasizing on the need for really diligent planning, so sound planning that's also is based in science, and then as a result taking that kind of those experience and sharing those experience, and as a way that helping us bringing this to scale. And again, your very important point of the inclusion of a diverse range of stakeholders. So well, thank you very much for giving those examples. So we've kind of gone from looking at what is nature-based solution, why is it important, how can it be done, and I'm also thinking but how do we actually make this attractive financially? How I mean, if you look at these examples, for example, that you have shown, it's really been a way of really been supported by public sector or financed by public sector. So I'd like to turn over to Torsten Thiele, who is the founder of the Global Ocean Trust. He's also an advisor to IUCN for the Blue Natural Capital Funding Facility and also on financial mechanism. So Torsten, welcome, and thank you as well for being part of this webinar. We're really interested in hearing about your experience and basically your thoughts on how can we get the private sector more involved. Thank you. Over to you. Torsten.
Thank you very much, Minna. Hello, everyone. I'm really delighted to have this chance to talk you through 3 slides and really encourage you to take a further look at this report, because I think one of the real advantages we had in putting it together was that it was based on a workshop that included both public and private sector financiers. And it's really bringing that together that is so critical. So my first slide, please. Blue infrastructure finance is really a way to marry 2 worlds. And these are, I used to work in infrastructure finance for 2 decades. And the world of infrastructure finance in its totality is a world where we talk about trillions. I've since been focusing on conservation finance, and we have a conservation finance audience here. And a lot of the discussions we have, financially speaking, is about millions. So what we really need to do is find a way to bridge those 2 worlds to get to the billions that we need to shift the conversation. And I think what is so fascinating with this concept is that it allows us to do that. It has benefits for both sides. It brings in additional risk management tools by better understanding these nature processes, which allows risk management and therefore lowering cost, and brings for infrastructure financiers who put long-term money in place the opportunity to really invest alongside with nature. And in order to get there, in order to do this cross-fertilization, we need a number of steps. And I think the first step that came through very clearly in our work is the crucial role that multilateral development banks are already playing in changing the approach to investing into sustainable infrastructure. They've really shifted their focus to a more systemic way of thinking, to an understanding of all the different impacts, and therefore the need of bringing the environmental, social, government standards, procurement principles. There's a whole toolkit that multilateral development banks have developed, are putting in place with examples. Now, what is key, however, is to make sure that this is applied to the specificities of the marine and coastal space. And that is where we still need some work to do, because we also need the institutional and governance framework in that environment. That is why this is not something that can be done without the public sector. And that public sector are governments, but they are also the regional, the local regulatory environments. So using the tool set of multilateral development banks that can work as the umbrella behind which private sector lenders can come on board is a crucial starting point, but we also need to work on these institutional frameworks. But then we have this great development in the conservation world around impact investors. So people who are willing to put equity capital into smaller projects, which then can be part of this umbrella provided by the blue infrastructure. And we will go in the next slide to an example of how that works in practice. But as I say, we need frameworks, and we now have a whole set of standards that are coming out that are being developed in this space, and that allow us to prepare these types of sustainable infrastructure projects. And the Paris Agreement is obviously a key leading role, provides a key guidance for us and a funding from a climate perspective. But what we are trying to show here is that this goes beyond climate mitigation, that bringing the blue infrastructure finance approach into the space allows you to deal with adaptation and resilience, i.e. spending money early on before tipping points are reached. And therefore, it's much more efficient. If we can go to the next slide, please. Blue infrastructure finance is about this integration that you can see in the little diagram. So you take these individual impact investment opportunities, you take these individual conservation projects, but put it inside an envelope of an infrastructure investment package. And that broader package helps de-risk the individual projects, but it also brings local communities and private sector local businesses, and therefore additional revenue sources and cash flows into the picture. And so this way of holistically putting it together is what allows you for a blended finance approach, a structuring that allows this transition, scaling up adaptation and sustainable landscapes. But there are limitations. This is not something that falls out. It requires work. And these limitations come from the fact that right now there is a shortage of specific bankable projects. And because of that shortage, there's a shortage also of capital dedicated to exactly these types of blue infrastructure. Now, both of these issues can and need to be overcome, because there is not a shortage of capital available for infrastructure. But within infrastructure finance, we want to prioritize these types of projects that have long-term the ability to not only deliver the right outcomes, but actually be financially safer. And that means thinking about additional ways and mechanisms to address challenges and find payments for. So payments for ecosystem services is one of the mechanisms we can think about as further ways to make this type of investment valuable. And on the adaptation side, the private finance is still in an early stage. So that's where these examples that have already been developed, and again, I encourage you to read the report, the amazing example from the Asian Development Bank, from Latin America, changes in Africa, the World Bank approaches. There's just a plethora of efforts in this direction. And I think what we are trying to show, and therefore bring this to a wider audience, that for private investors, this is a very exciting space to look at, because these current limitations can be overcome through an integrated blue infrastructure finance approach that values these nature-based solutions. And my final slide, please. The key takeaways are these new blended finance solutions help de-risk these investments and therefore make them attractive to private investors, but they require a systems-based approach with precise metrics. And this is how you actually deliver this. So it requires more data, but the data reduces risk. And you do need an enabling framework on the government side, but the government has the benefit from delivering that framework. It unleashes private money to help deliver these solutions. The carbon market mechanisms can help to fill some of the financing gaps, but we really want to go beyond just carbon. And the role of multilateral development banks, in particular in developing countries, to bring these concepts to fruition and engage with private sector partners is key and can help us as the entry point. And the MDBs are very keen on it. And I was very delighted that in our session, we had this buy-in both from the development banks and from the active players in this field, but also from traditional infrastructure investors, whose main challenge in this very varying world is to find assets that have long-term value. And healthy coastal nature is one of these categories. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Torsten. That was excellent. Thank you for bringing us a little bit closer on how we can actually bridge the two worlds of conservation and finance, and hopefully it will end up being a happy marriage. It's really, benefiting from the cross-fertilization. And very importantly as well, you highlighted the role of multilateral development banks, and the way that the role that they have really played and kind of adopting a more systematic thinking in relation to kind of sustainability, but also the various toolkits available and set of standards, which is for sustainable projects and in infrastructure. And I take home message from you here as well, I understand, is really about integration focusing on integration and into this kind of infrastructure packages, and the possibilities for actually entering additional revenue sources. So you talked a lot about the blended finance approach and kind of some key aspects of successes there, but also highlighted the shortage of really bankable projects in this area. So that is obviously a shortcoming at the moment. But maybe you could just elaborate a little bit more. You talked about the blended finance approach and kind of, you know, what is in that mix, but in terms of maybe the proportions, how do you see this?
Sure. As we described, setting these structures up at the beginning is costly because you have to go through this risk assessment. So it's important to have donor support in that construction phase of the project, of the financing. Once the financing is in place, you can have returns. So give you just one example. I worked on a blue bond for the Baltic Sea, where it was understood in order to have benefits in the ocean, we needed better waste management plants around the Baltic. So support from a multilateral or a development bank to put the structure in place, but then the actual bond is a financial instrument, private sector buyers, so private money goes into this sort of plant. So that's a way to actually deal with these proportions. The proportions will vary. In some instances where the output is more about, for instance, marine protection, you may need more donor type funding in that. So in the Seychelles Blue Bond, there's a larger proportion of that sort of money needed, but this will vary and can be adjusted. That's the nice thing with this financial packaging. You can apply it specifically to each area. But I think the key point never to lose is the cost benefit of these measures. The net present value of these investments is hugely higher done in this way, because you have a longer term outcome. So we have a World Bank study that looked at 3,000 different scenarios confirming exactly that. So the value is there. The unleashing requires some support money. Once it's out there, private money can come in there to deliver it.
So when you basically see this blended finance in terms of like the different types of investors or investment into it would actually come at different stages. So initially, what you said, that's really the important part, is the initial investment, and that will come more from the public sector. And then there are different sequences of when additional finance should come in.
It's can also, another component of the blending is that in order to deliver the lower risk for the private sector, make it bankable, you may need, for instance, longer term contractual arrangements. So if you want to buy the marine energy, for instance, you may have a longer term contract for that, where the public sector can play a role in. But given this underlying bankability of this, what is really being addressed here with the nature-based solution is the increased volatility and risk as climate affects the coasts, and therefore identifying how very specifically the nature-based solution provides value for money. And that's how we can deliver on this bankability and add in additional sources of revenues once we've designed the project.
Okay, thank you very much. Excellent. So we have a long range of questions here. I'd like to follow up with each one of you, but I think it would be a good opportunity to let in some of our participants to ask any questions. So I'd like to turn over to my colleague, Jürgen Zetterberg, who's actually managing the Blue Natural Capital Funding Facility. Jürgen, could we have the first question, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Mina. We have meanwhile received a number of very interesting questions, and I would just raise them as they come in. The first one is for Steve, and it's related to the NDCs and how the NDCs then can also impact the blue carbon projects. How will the commitment of countries in the NDCs impact blue carbon projects and blue carbon financing? Some governments have already included blue carbon in the NDCs, but other NDCs have not even considered blue carbon. Steve, do you have an answer for that one?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jürgen. So Steve, if you can unmute yourself and address the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, it's a great question. You know, really the NDCs are so important because it sets out a country's priorities in terms of how they're going to tackle climate change. A good number of countries did recognize blue carbon ecosystems or coastal marine ecosystems in some sort of way within their first round of NDCs. And increasingly, there's a lot of interest in doing so in this coming round of NDCs. Some of the reticence about doing so, it relates to how do you quantify the greenhouse gas emissions, and the NDCs focused on greenhouse gas emissions reductions. But there are two parts to an NDC. There's the adaptation side and there's a mitigation side. And I guess a simple message would be that if you are planning on protecting ecosystems, restoring them for an adaptation benefit, you're very unlikely to have a net greenhouse gas negative impact. It's most likely going to be positive. And so there's progress that could be made in terms of including coastal ecosystems as part of adaptation and then improving the quantification as we move forward to the next round of NDCs. But the fundamental point is get your coastal ecosystems in your NDC because it sets the stage, which then helps bring the finance, which then helps bring the projects.
Thank you very much. Dorothy, is there anything you would perhaps like to add and to the discussion of NDCs from policy perspective?
Yeah, I think Steve covered it quite well, and I think it's really looking forward to reading more submissions now of the revised NDCs because they are certainly giving away what countries' priorities are, and I think that obviously gives a lot of signals also where various types of funding will be put in the future. So the more we see those in NDCs, the more we really get a sense that this is of importance to the countries and that we can work with them on the various levels.
Thank you very much. I think we can take some more questions. Jürgen, have another question, please?
Yes, we have received a number of questions for Torsten. So to answer all of them will take quite a while. So I try to combine them and so that it's a bit more efficient when answering. But in case the person would like to raise it again, please do so. So Torsten, the first one is to talk a bit about the limitations of the bankability of the infrastructure projects, and this kind of also translates into the next question that asks you to explain a bit also the role of payment for ecosystem services and just the reality that the payments from the ecosystem services are quite small when compared to the actual large-scale infrastructure investments.
Yeah, very good point. So the starting point is infrastructure is being built and will be financed. So there will be roads, there will be ports, there will be coastal fortification. What we are arguing is that one of the ways to build these roads, ports, coastal structures better is to think about nature, and thinking about these nature-based solutions properly actually improves the financial profile of the project. So very simply put, take a coast, you assume there will be rising waters. Steve can explain that much better. So you normally will have to build some kind of hard fortification. That would cost you a certain amount of money. Now the engineer will figure out that building a mangrove forest there can achieve the same goal. Great. So we have already an equality between the nature-based solution and the hard traditional solution. What I am now arguing is, great, we want to build the mangrove forest, restore it here. As it turns out, the mangrove forest does more things than just protect that bit of coastline. The mangrove forest absorbs carbon. The mangrove forest offers livelihoods for people. The mangrove forest is a biodiversity space. So at the moment, in a traditional way, even if we came to the conclusion to plant the mangrove forest as part of the infrastructure, we don't think about this extra point. So the fact that these extra issues exist, even if the payment for ecosystem services in the beginning is small, And even if the users and the beneficiaries are quite diverse, it is all additional benefit. And that's why it helps with the solution. But the benefits then go beyond that. So we have a financial reason to do it, but we have a benefit of buy-in into environmental social outcomes for that region. So if I am the coastal city of Rotterdam or Mombasa, I will think about what type of wetland restoration I should do as part of my port project. And I will have thought before, because that is the traditional way of thinking, maybe it costs me a little bit extra to restore the wetlands, but I will still do it because it's good for my city or region. I am saying this can be done and make your financing easier. This is actually additional financial benefit. And if we figure it out, we will all benefit around this. So these blue carbon type projects, which can bring insurance, can bring in blended finance, can deal with these payment for ecosystem services, are really all ways to make the project better, safer, and more financeable.
Thank you very much for a very concise and actually being able to answer all of those questions all in one. We actually have plenty of time for questions, so we can take another one from the audience. Jürgen?
Mm-hmm. So the next one is a very interesting one in my point of view. And it talks a bit about the slide, Thorsten, you showed with the key takeaways that we need an enabling framework and we need to have the public sector on board. A member of the audience is asking, what can we do if there's lack of political will that we see, especially in developing countries? What if politicians are not buying into NBS? What can still be done to get NBS and blue infrastructure projects and investments off the ground?
Thank you very much for that question. So I'd like to turn to the panelists. Is there anyone that would like to start to address this option?
I'm happy to start, but then I would pass it on to the others because they know better.
Yes, thank you. Steve, would you like to kick off?
Oh, Thorsten, did you want to kick off and then I'll say something, or should I go first?
You can go
ahead.
first.
Okay, so that's a really good question, and developing countries have an advantage in some way over developed countries because their shoreline is not being fortified to the same degree quite often as developed countries do. So they have natural adaptive capacity opportunities there, but they lack the financing, which is a real challenge. You know, we've worked in a number of countries, and there is certainly a dynamic. They may be existing. They have areas which will need protecting by flood defenses, capital cities perhaps. They have rural areas which they are protecting with a lot of abandoned land maybe. But for people owning land, there is value in ownership, even if the land brings no return. And so there's an opportunity there maybe to do something with those people to try and make them whole and provide space for ecosystems to be restored. The dynamic that we see is that there's a hope that finance will come along that will fortify the landscape and sea levels won't rise. And now is really the time when we need to think about adaptation and rolling back where infrastructure is not needed. And so I think it's, I don't really have an answer to the question. It's a challenging one, but I will recognize that countries are facing real difficulties here. There's an opportunity now because infrastructure projects take so long to build and to enact, and then they're in the ground for so long. You're talking 50 to 100 years. We really need to be trying to help these countries make the decisions, the difficult decisions now to move towards adaptation and reduce their risk into the future, rather than wait until it's too late, until the pressures build, until catastrophic failures take place.
Do it up front. Thank you. So, for example, Thorsten, would you agree that developing countries have an advantage over developed countries?
Yes, but it's also, I think, we are not arguing that they should do this out of the good of their hearts. We are arguing this is financially and politically better to do. So they should do it out of their own self-interest. But frankly, it's not just a developing country issue. we all know of countries, and Steve happens to live in one, where on the national federal level, there may not be the same enthusiasm, but it can be found at the subnational level. It can be found at the state or at the regional level. And again, that is a great entry point all around the world to say, we work with those entities that are willing to engage around that. And these structures can allow financing to be brought at these different types of levels.
Thank you. So I'm really glad as well as that you brought up the important role of the kind of municipalities and when it comes to planning. And you say, yes, this can make perfectly both political and economic sense, but do you think there is any kind of convincing to be made, or are there enough successful examples to really, you know, push towards this development?
I'll pass that to Dorothy, who has been very active talking to these different bodies, but there are regional networks and mayors and city organizations. So Dorothy, explain how it works.
Please.
Yeah, thank you, Torsten. Well, I think up also on the point made, you know, how can we work with bottom-up schemes? And I think what we see on the coastal restoration and conservation side, we start seeing results, and even if they're still on a rather small scale, I think it's these types of pilots that bring also the data and the experience of bringing these nature-based solutions projects to life in the first place. But you know, how we forward to scale. And I think also I agree with that there's a lot.
I think we lost you there a little bit, Dorothy. I think your connection is going in and out. Are you still there? I think well, okay. So maybe we will pause there because we're having some difficulties hearing you. So time runs really quickly when you're. So I would say that we could take at least one more question. Other questions for the audience?
So what the audience is also wondering, whether the panelists have some actual examples on the ground of projects which kind of showcase what are really good blended finance approaches, in particular when it comes to getting the insurance sector on board.
Okay, thank you very much. So we did have some kind of concrete examples of project, but maybe we haven't touched enough about insurance. I know Torsten, you mentioned a little bit about the sector and in relation to risk. Is there any good examples at hand? We do believe in the power of good examples. I think this is a great opportunity to share experiences as well. Is there anyone who would like to start with a good example? I would hand it over also to Dorothy, but I think the connection is not that great. Steve, I'm sure you have other examples than the one that you could fit in your short presentation.
Sure. I can't speak so much to the insurance industry, but you know, the project that we showed from the Hamilton Wetlands Restoration Project, that was in a way a blended finance project. The state and the federal agencies provided assistance and a large amount of funding to build the project itself. But it was a project with the Port of Auckland, and the Port of Auckland were invested in this because they wanted a deepening of their port so that larger container ships could get into the port. And so they were a major funder of the project also. And so there was a sort of regional development aspect to this that was funded by private finance, and then there was a component of it that was funded by the state. So those kind of projects, I think, would be good examples. On the previous point, also linking across to that, I think, you know, the example in the developing world, there's a lot of landowners who I think we could help develop a better environment, to develop their livelihood, and they're eking something out on marginal land because they own the marginal land. And if we can bring finance that helps them free up from that land, but develop a livelihood that's long-term sustainable, that they want to have, not push them somewhere else, but, you know, help support local communities. I think that's where private finance can come in, and maybe the insurance industry also, because you can reduce the risk to somebody else if you can create space in the landscape. Perhaps the scarcest resource we have in the landscape is space. And so how do we make the most of that?
Mm-hmm.
If I may add, for the insurance side, there are really two aspects of insurance that are critical here. We were very lucky to have the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance as part of the work on this project, and there's been some really interesting discussions around ocean risk, insuring of coral reefs, how do you bring people in. So that's what I would call sort of a high-end complexity type discussion. But there is another discussion which is often underlooked. Only about 20% of coasts are insured at all. So there's a lot of asset value along coast, especially in smaller communities where they do not have insurance. And so bringing insurance to this coastal space that allows for resilience and where protective measures have an impact on the premium paid, all can be part of this. And we have now much better mechanisms to have smaller payments, different type of insurance contracts. So there's a great opportunity to bring insurance into the space, just like we're saying we need to bring finance into space, we also can bring further insurance into the space. And so that exchange that we're having with the insurance sector around risk and nature-based solutions is a really helpful part, and I've been very encouraged from the various discussions we've had both with the insurers and the reinsurance sector.
Thank you very much. We are coming very close now to the end of this webinar, but I think I've enjoyed so much all the questions. So we can take one final question if it's a short one.
Mm-hmm. We have indeed an interesting short question, and it talks about marine protected areas, which is also very relevant to the BNCFF, and we are currently supporting such a project. And the question raised, and maybe this can be answered by Dorothy, is when you're financing MPAs with private investors, what are revenue streams that can make the project financially sustainable?
Thank you. So Dorothy, do we have you?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but actually, Jürgen, you can answer it much better.
Yes, so happy then to put my moderator hat off and will answer the question directly. So MPAs, you have several potential revenue stream, and one which seems to be most promising or most easily to tap into at the moment is tourism. So especially after COVID-19 is over and we have the tourism industry up and running again, because you as a tourist, you're enjoying an ecosystem service, and you're also more likely willing to pay for the ecosystem service, while many local peoples don't have the financial means to do so. So this is why this is probably the most direct, the most easily lifted and used income stream. Others are certainly also fishing, but fishing is very controversial in many places. This is why it will also need to be flanked with tourism. You can also imagine some other economic sources, for example, planting seaweed, which also benefits from marine protected areas in the seaweed industry. But as being said, at the moment, it's still about making the case with tourists, which is the easiest one, and then we have all to extend to include then also the more challenging income streams, including also then the blue carbon, in case mangrove forests and seagrass beds happen to be within the marine protected areas.
Thank you. I think we have to stop there, Jürgen. So thank you very much for that input. I think we would have needed another hour to kind of debunk some of this, but I think we've managed to actually very demonstrate that habitats like tidal mangrove forests, seagrasses, and coral reefs can really help make infrastructure investment better, more resilient, and financially more attractive. So I think that this has been very, very informative. I'd also like to add that, emphasize again, to watch out for the nature-based solution standard, which ICN is putting forward. We're also in the process of setting up a nature-based solution facility to really provide technical and policy skill to kind of shape the development and have investment, and also in partnership with public, private, and business stakeholders. So we're really looking forward to continue to really push for the development together with partners for more bankable project under the Blue Natural Capital Funding Facility. as well as working with our members like Conservation International, who's currently assembling an international group to advance the practice of green-grey infrastructure, as well as continue collaboration so that we can help move this forward and make it a long-term, long-lasting marriage. So on that note, I would like to hand it back over to David for some closing remarks. So thank you very much for your active participation. It's been a pleasure moderating this session. David.
Well, thank you. Just in closing, I just want to thank you all for presenting and for this great report. I encourage everyone to read it. And I encourage everyone, if you're not already a member of the Conservation Finance Alliance or receive our newsletter, please sign up for that and watch this space, because blue natural capital, blue infrastructure is really an area that has great potential and a great need for attention. And so we're thrilled again that you all were able to share your results and share your knowledge and wisdom about this. So thanks very much. And we'll post a recording of this on our website, as well as share it with our partners here so they can post as well. Thanks again, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your day and evening. Bye now.